Hello there, member of the general public. This is an episode of our monthly reading club that we're exceptionally unlocking for you. If you're not familiar with our reading club, it's a means of getting to grips with the essential texts to understand the most important social, political, and economic themes of our times. We're now halfway through our 2022 syllabus. The first 6 months of the year were dedicated to emergency politics and control. We thought, with the pandemic in our rearview mirror and a climate emergency up ahead of us, to explore the key texts around the politics of exception and the politics of fear through works by Carl Schmitt, Giorgio Agamben, Michel Foucault, Frank Furedi, Corey Robin, and many others, and here in this episode works by Andreas Malm and Adam Tooze. The next 3 months will be dedicated to cynical ideology, looking at questions of belief and disbelief, political trust, and conspiracy theories, through works by Slavoj Žižek, Anthony Giddens, Timothy Melly, and more. And we'll close out the year by examining whether the concept of neo-feudalism is the right way to understand contemporary political economic transformations. We try to keep the amount of reading each month fairly digestible. More often than not, it's only 50 pages or so, and rarely more than 200. And of course, there's plenty of additional reading on the syllabus if you want to explore further. If this sounds like it's for you and you'd like to follow along, join us at patreon.com/bungacast and select tier number 2. In doing so, you'll get access to all our paywalled episodes, which means at least 2 unique episodes a month, including a regular cast of guests, bonus content from interviews, which, to be honest, is where all the best stuff comes out, and a lot more. Plus, you obviously get, of course, access to the reading club, where you're invited to submit questions and comments for us to discuss. We want it to be an ongoing dialogue and not just us simply projecting our views. So anyway, I'll shut up now. Here's our discussion on Eco-Leninism. Hope you enjoy it and see you very soon. Hello everyone, intimate inner circle people, members of the reading club, second tier subscribers. This is the final edition of the first section of the reading club of 2022, specifically the section on emergency politics and control. Before we actually get into it and say any more, I'm sure you'll all be aware of the fact that there are local reading clubs in several places around the world. Some of the people are still looking for people to meet up with where they are, and there's some very keen, eager people. Sometimes there's 2 people or 3 people who are still looking for other people with whom to discuss the books. And I think it's important to emphasize that it might be difficult for you to meet up monthly, but the syllabus is there. And although the episodes here come out monthly, generally towards the very end of the month, we're a little bit late this month. We're about a week late. Apologies for that. But if you were waiting for it last week, but the idea is that you can hold these local reading clubs following along the syllabus and following along the episodes after the fact, if you want to. If that makes it a little bit less onerous for you, if you want to do them every 6 weeks, be our guest. We hope that what we provide is useful in thinking through these issues, because again, this is meant to be a part of a broader intellectual and political project of trying to get to grips with some of the most important themes of our time. And so, what works for you, that's great. If you can join along, and if you can get your questions in advance of the readings, fantastic. If you can't, that's not a problem. We'll try to address them in the future. So if you do have things that are brought up, issues, questions that were brought up by the episode, by your reading, and want to submit them a month on, we can still discuss them at the future reading club. So we can keep that kind of dialogue aspect of this going. I'll say a little bit about what's coming up over the next 3 months, the kind of the next section of the syllabus at the very end of this, just to sort of trail that and to discuss through kind of the issues that we want to discuss, the perspectives that we're looking at, and a little bit about how to go about it. But for now, I'll pass over to Phil, who's going to talk us through this month's reading and what we're going to discuss.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So this is a combination of 2 readings. One reading which we've done before in a way, which was also linked with an interview with the author, and this is Andreas Malm. We had Andreas on in episode 168 at the peak of the global pandemic in January 2021, or in the middle of it at least anyway, if not exactly the peak in terms of transmission or what have you. And the book is Corona, Climate, Chronic Emergency, War, Communism in the 21st Century. We've paired it up with a essay by the historian Adam Tooze, who's also been on the podcast before. And this is an essay that he wrote in November 2021 called Ecological Leninism, where he tries to elaborate a paradigm out of Andreas Malm's various writings on the on an appropriate radical response to the climate crisis, the climate emergency. So basically the inspiration for this, I suppose, was that through looking at emergency politics, and hopefully I don't think anyone would disagree, any of our listeners would disagree with the notion that emergency politics is central to understanding political order at the moment, in the midst of the war in Ukraine and coming out of lockdown and everything else. And we've gone through a few kind of iterations. We've looked at kind of the political theory paradigms of Corey Robin. We've looked at the Foucauldian critical account of biopolitics. We've looked at the classical kind of authoritarian paradigm with Carl Schmitt's concept of the political. And I wanted to return to look at the radical, a radical variant or a radical paradigm, and specifically one that models itself on a Marxist understanding of politics as to what it might offer. And so this is particularly why the framing that Tooze provides in his essay is so useful. So with that out of the way, the other element, I suppose, which this wasn't obvious when we devised the reading club for this year. This hadn't happened yet, but obviously there's also the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the response to it. And I think it's worth reading the Ecological Leninist, the eco-Leninist paradigm through the response to the war in Ukraine, and we're going to try and do that too. So with all of that said, I suppose the core question, which I don't propose that we answer directly in our discussion, but the one that I'd like to keep kind of hovering over the discussion, and also the one which I'd like, kind of to put forward in readers' minds, and also to have listeners in listeners' minds, and to have listeners respond, is how will the emergency politics of the radical left parlay into the broader frameworks of emergency politics, and particularly the liberal and technocratic emergency politics that we're living through at the moment? So anything to add?
That's quite tantalizing to have a question like that posed, but we can't answer it directly.
Well, you can give it a shot if you want. The reason I said not answer it directly is because I thought it was perhaps too complex to answer directly, but give it a shot.
Easily. There you go.
Thank you, George. We can always rely on you to answer our complex questions directly. So, Alex, anything to add before we get stuck in?
No. Let's get started, because I have plenty to say on the specifics of this.
Okay. So as I say, I would urge listeners to go back to the episode we had with Andreas Malm and to re-listen to it if you have the time, which is episode 168. And I want to focus, rather than retreading the ground of Malm's book, which we'll talk about more as the discussion gets going, I wanted just to briefly summarize Adam Tooze's essay. And so what Tooze draws out is he contrasts basically two possible left responses to the climate crisis. One is a kind of Green New Deal model, modeled on the New Deal, the original Rooseveltian New Deal itself, and indeed the anti-fascist kind of popular mobilization of the Second World War, leading to the construction of the social democratic state, expanded welfare provision, reduced inequalities, and a strong, legitimate and powerful state mobilizing technology, capital, economic resources on an enormous scale, and achieving a tremendous transformation in politics and social order as a result. He's aware in self-critical mode, he's aware this could be too easy, and simply kind of imagining that you could pull, kind of a Green New Deal off the shelf, as it were, on the Rooseveltian model and produce similar effects today. He realizes that's too easy, and this is what leads him into his discussion of the eco-Leninist paradigm, which is drawn out by Malm across various books, not only across the book that we've chosen for this session, Corona Climate Chronic Emergency, but also How to Blow Up a Pipeline and other work that Malm has done, including White Skin, Black Fuel. So here the paradigm is the one that Malm uses, and he calls himself a Leninist, and the one that he deploys is the idea of war communism from the end of the First World War. And when the Russian revolutionary state was besieged on all sides. And he also kind of makes, Adam Tooze makes a point about how this required a shift away from, because they no longer had the access to the resources of the old Tsarist Empire, which had been captured by counter-revolutionary forces, including, kind of ironically enough, the coal of the Donbass region, which is being fought over today, obviously in Ukraine. And so they had to innovate. And one of the ways in which they innovated was that they filled the Bolsheviks filled the trains with wood fuel. And so Malm takes this kind of as a metaphor of the kind of the rapid, radical decarbonization that could be possible. And it's a way of getting around the question, he wants to make, I think the intention is to make clear that drastic, forceful, determined political action is necessary without promises of cornucopian promises of the blessed future to come, but the acceptance of privation and suffering, which was the core of the core of war, of the politics of war communism. And he takes this as a model for what could be offered. So Tooze talks through, some of the differences between social democracy and eco-Leninism, or Green New Dealism and eco-Leninism, and mentions, for instance, the difference in time horizons, and also makes the point about the fact that Malm is very conscious of the fact that this kind of politics seems to have no capacity for it to be enacted, because it's a revolutionary, according to Malm at least, it's a revolutionary crisis, but without a revolutionary actor or subject who's able to address it. So is there anything else you guys want to add to the brief summary of the Toozian essay?
Well, I think, first of all, I'd like to say that as I assume that you two will be especially harsh on Malm, and the politics that he advances, it falls to me to provide a little bit of balance, not for the sake of balance, but out of intellectual honesty and fairness, which sometimes is deficient.
Of course, you are the intellectually honest and fair one. Please
exactly.
Go ahead.
So, no, I mean, look, obviously, if you guys were Greens, I would be taking the opposite stance. I'd be bending the stick in the other direction. I think it's important to say that Malm's account, I think, is analytically pretty rich. He is pretty honest and genuinely radical, right? I think there's a genuine radicalism there in going to the root of the problem. And so you might disagree, and I disagree with a lot of what he proposes, but I think that there's a logic there which has to be tangled with and taken seriously, and not dismissed simply by screaming about, this is just a way to support ruling elites and their imposition of emergency rule. Not least because if we consider ourselves to be Leninists, I mean, I don't know if George does, I'm pretty certain Phil does, that I think we have to take this seriously. And I do think he presents a consistent Leninist argument. All that said, in response to the specific question, I think it's telling that, for example, with regard to social democracy, Tooze rightfully highlights, and actually Malm already highlights in his book, the difference in time frames, right? So social democracy always assumes it has time on its side, or at least traditionally it did. I don't know if that would be the case for contemporary social democracy or even a lot of post-war social democracy. By the 1970s, I don't think social democrats thought they had time on their side, precisely because of the crisis of the 1970s and because they no longer really believed in a parliamentary road to socialism in many cases, certainly by the 1980s, that was the case. So that time frame question, I think, is a very important one to highlight. And I think it's right to say that, climate change does impose itself the question of time becomes important. I don't think we can gradually respond to it. I think it will take some very serious measures to kind of respond to it, and we don't have forever, right? I think that certainly is the case. It presents a very serious civilizational challenge, and which, if it isn't responded to, it will create a global situation in which the cost, the sheer amount of human labor dedicated to merely keeping things livable or keeping things equal will be so great that it would seem, retrospectively absurd that we didn't take more action now. precisely because having to live in a world of greater droughts, hurricanes, natural disasters, that will just be a huge waste of human resources. So I think that time frame thing is very right. I think though where Malm shows his hand and where he shows himself to be anti-cornucopian, and this is, Phil already hinted at this. I think that's where my greatest problem with what Malm advances with this eco-Leninism is that it doesn't promise in any way a better life for people. And I think this is clear in a thing that Tooze points out, that, war communism entailed a switch to wood instead of coal and oil under the most brutal, dramatic situation of a fight for survival, life and death struggle in the early 1920s. The climate change version that Malm advances would see a switch to wind and solar. But what I think is telling in this is that both entail a switch to a less energy dense solution. Obviously, burning coal is much less efficient than burning coal or oil. And likewise, wind and solar itself is less efficient than a solution like nuclear energy. So I think that really is a tell as to what kind of future is envisaged, not one of greater energy production, which would be plentiful, cheap, and clean. Importantly, it's one in which we would be making do with less.
So I've got some responses to that, but do you want to come in before I respond to Alex, George?
I just wanted to thank Alex for his intellectual honesty. I think it's really, I really value, I recognize it, and I value it. I just think that the fundamental premise of around that time frame of emergency politics, that we don't have time. I just don't accept that. I just fundamentally think capitalism will persist. It's a shortcut. It's a
capitalism will persist. I'm not arguing that capitalism will persist.
It's like I just think I just react against it in a negative way, to be bounced into some political action because time is running out. It's later than you think. Well, like people have been saying this for such a long time, and it just doesn't make me panicked in the way that perhaps it's intended to.
It doesn't make me panic either. I don't buy it. Like what's the point? I don't buy it. Like I don't feel an urge to deal with climate change. I would much rather never have to think about it at all, personally. Right. But I buy the argument that scientists make, even those who are, let's say, of an eco-modernist persuasion and who are not catastrophists and who are not saying that if we don't act within 5 years or now or yesterday, that the whole world will explode. I don't buy that at all. But action is necessary. We can't, if we continue on current trajectory for 50 years, 100 years, that will seriously endanger human civilization, not human survival.
I disagree.
Civilization.
Well, so I don't know, Alex, 50 or 100 years doesn't really sound like an emergency to me. I mean, I
didn't say it's emergency. I didn't use the term emergency. Like it's an urgency.
That's an emergency for the
no. It's an urgency, not an emergency, and they're different things.
Oh my god. Okay, but the point is, if you take that away from Malm, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much is left, right? This is a discussion we had. So, but let me respond to some of your points as well. So, this is a discussion so for listeners who might be new to us, this is a discussion we had with Lee Phillips, the writer on the environment and science, back in episode 91, and his reading of he's kind of been following all of the IPCC reports, and he follows these debates very closely, and his reading of the situation is that the catastrophic scenario, we would be closer to the end of this century, assuming no action is taken in the interim. Now, obviously, obviously there are plenty of catastrophists who say that the inability to contain the average rise in global temperature to 2 degrees is itself kind of impossible to deal with under current kind of levels of technology and development and what have you. But I am persuaded by Lee and by others' accounts that the objective kind of emergency just isn't there, at least at the moment. Now, I wouldn't say I've written about Lenin, but that does not make me a Leninist. For the simple reason, so I have to disagree with you, Alex, despite your intellectual honesty and generosity and deep integrity that in fact I'm not a Leninist, for the simple reason that, I think it's meaningless in the absence of an organized labor movement, because the point of Leninism is a specific kind of vision of political leadership, and there's nothing to politically lead, at least with respect to an organized labor movement. And so therefore...
That's a bit of a cop-out.
Not at all.
That's a bit of a disavowing. If you disavow Lenin 3 times, then just be careful. But no, I mean...
Not at all. It's absolutely...
What about the analysis, though?
Well, I'm getting to that. So my point being, though, that to say Leninism without threading through or taking the full measure of the absence of an organized labor movement, that seems to me to be, kind of a contradiction that just can't, is unsustainable. It can't hold up. So when Malm acknowledges the fact there isn't like a revolutionary actor for his vision, but nonetheless, it must persist with this kind of, he doesn't kind of draw out he doesn't think about what does a society look like which doesn't have a revolutionary actor, right? He says that he takes it as a kind of a hurdle, a practical problem, rather than having kind of social and political consequences. It's like a matter of organization. Well, we would like this, but we don't have the people to do it. How do we get around that? So he takes it as a practical problem without drawing out what the consequences for social order are of a society that doesn't have an organized labor movement. And that's a serious, it seems to me, analytical problem. Alex, you wanted to come in?
No, I think that's well put. I mean, I don't have a problem. I take the point about the historical specificity of Leninism, and it's the difficulty in just simply applying Leninism to today in that context. And Tooze puts it nicely as well, that climate change is a revolutionary problem without a revolutionary subject. I think that's correct. But the lesson, I think, or to extract, what Leninism would be shorthand here for, and again, it's probably not doing justice to it, but it's a shorthand, would be precisely that question of leadership. And secondly, that aspect, I guess, to put it in the simplest possible terms, be ready, which Malm cites, right? To have a kind of a self-conscious vanguard, which is able to act in a moment of emergency and to turn the repressive forces of the state, for example, against itself, which is what Malm precisely proposes with climate change, using the example of 1917 and so on. But I think you're right in that in the absence of a mass movement to lead, with which you could have a Leninist relationship, in relation to this mass movement, it becomes an argument for adventurism or terrorism, which Malm is explicit about in terms of, blowing up pipelines and so on, direct action.
Yeah, and therefore, I mean, anti-Leninist, there's a whole debate in Russian populism and Russian Marxism about the redundancy of terrorist tactics. I mean, it was one of the kind of core contributions of Bolshevik political theory and revolutionary and pre-revolutionary Russia. But I mean, I suppose, so, there is a deeper point, which I think is the most important one, which is that if you're simply kind of crafting ideas and theories without reference to the underlying dynamics, then inevitably the content of your vessel will be given by factors that are outside of your control. So in this case, you can kind of spout off about kind of Leninism and war communism and Marxism all you want. If there's no organized labor movement to relate those ideas to, inevitably those ideas will be molded to fit around existing interests and existing power structures. And there are no labor power structures.
Well,
there is no expression of organized labor interests. So my question to you, Alex, honest as you are, is then what does that look like when these kind of Marxist ideas are remolded around existing kind of power structures and existing organized interests? No, and my guess is they end up looking very different from Leninism.
Yeah, and indeed that would be probably my second big criticism of Malm, secondary to the cornucopian question, which is the democratic one, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it. Malm makes the point, and I'm trying to look through my notes here to find it, that yes, the Leninist argument would mean taking over the state, but actually, and I'm quoting here, all we have to work with is the dreary bourgeois state tethered to the circuits of capital as always. And here I think lies Malm's problem in a lack of sensitivity to the risks, to put it lightly, that this would entail. It might diminish our domination over nature. Incidentally, I think domination of nature or mastery over nature is a good thing. And that would involve, for a lot of preservation, conservation, and fighting against climate change, because that would be true mastery. But, anyway, let's just put it as, dealing with climate change. It might allow it to deal with climate change, but at the cost of increasing domination over man. And I think that's the real problem, which he's a little bit blithe about. And this is where the emergency, the nature of the imminent emergency and the catastrophism leads him to justify those risks because he thinks it's worth it, because otherwise nothing has any meaning, because the world explodes effectively. So I think that's a big problem. And I think Tooze is right in saying that war communism was administered by a revolutionary party in a life and death struggle for survival. But this is not our situation, at least not yet, says Tooze. And I think that's right. And we cannot, in this situation, conjure up or concoct the emergency, as Malm tries to do rhetorically, through persuasion is what I'm saying. And indeed, ultimately falls not to persuasion, but to direct action. That ends up being the practice that Malm proposes. So the problem is that with climate change, it might well never come. We might be aware that there is an urgency of dealing with climate change, of reducing emissions, of various forms of mitigation and indeed adaptation. But the fact is, the nature of climate change, of it being gradual and it being dispersed, in the sense of, there's a hurricane here, which is more frequent than usual. There's more drought here. The Sahel dries up and pushes people upwards to migrate to elsewhere, whatever. All these things which are happening and will intensify don't happen as an overnight thing where suddenly it's an obvious emergency, as in the case of the White Army invading Russia. So because you never have that emergency moment, it means that democratic persuasion and democratic power is necessary. And that's where I find, Malm very problematic, in that his argument leads to adventurism, leads to terrorism, because he abandons democratic persuasion, because he thinks it's an emergency, and if you can't convince people of the emergency, then you just have to act. And I think, well, no, you kind of do have to rely on persuasion, because the emergency doesn't impose itself subjectively.
Yeah. Sure. So, George, did you want to respond to any of that?
Well, I think the fundamental starting point that climate change is a revolutionary problem. I just don't agree with that. I just don't think that is correct, because a revolutionary problem, I actually wrote down what exactly does that mean? Not in those words, but probably just wrote a question mark, underlined it and wrote a question mark. But what is a revolutionary problem? It's one that can only be opposed to a revolutionary subject. So if you don't have a revolutionary subject, you don't have any revolutionary problems. I mean, that might be me being either crude or intellectually dishonest, but I'm happy to accept either or both.
No, I mean, I don't neither. I just think you're wrong. I mean, I think you're wrong, because I think we can say,
I won't accept that.
We can say that there's socialism, or you can say socialism or barbarism, right?
There is another answer to this, right? Is it a revolutionary problem? Is another way of saying, can capitalism solve the climate crisis, right? There is abundant evidence to show that it can solve the climate crisis. And indeed, it could have solved the climate crisis had things, it wouldn't have required a lot for things to have gone differently in the 1970s, right? So, and it seems to me it already is solving the climate, in the course of trying to solve the climate crisis. So in its own kind of ramshackle, haphazard and inordinately costly and increasingly authoritarian way, but I don't doubt that capitalism can solve it. So it doesn't seem to me that it's a revolutionary problem. And a revolutionary problem has to surely be a social problem, not one that is imposed on us by nature.
But it is so. Okay, I think two things to that. One, the revolutionary problem is, or rather, to frame it as will or can capitalism solve climate change is to question begging. I think the question is, can climate change be solved within capitalism, right? Because otherwise it seems...
That's what I said. It amounts to the same thing.
It isn't the same thing, because one is, can capitalism solve it, which seems to suggest that can capital of its own devices solve it? And the other is, can it be solved within capitalism, which is to say, still with conscious action, demands, etc., actual social struggle, political struggle.
You're overstating it, but go on anyway.
No, but I think it will need some political struggle, because otherwise it will, even within intra-elite intra-elite kind of competition.
No, but I'm not denying that.
So
it's a question of whether or not it's something which kind of can only be solved by a revolutionary reconstitution of society.
No, and I agree. I think there needs to be some, probably some political revolution which leads to it. And again, a political revolution can be entirely a change within the elite, but that still is important. In fact, most revolutions are a change within the elite. So I think that's true. The second point is. Remind me of what you finished saying, because I had a specific response to this. Yes, it's something that is imposed by nature, and that it's revolution supposes a social problem. I think Malm is clear, and this comes through in his discussion of critical vulnerability theory. Now, critical vulnerability theory in the 1970s emphasized the social determinants of vulnerability, saying that basically natural disasters don't just happen. It's social, like it's the fact that people are poor or don't have the right infrastructure, whatever. And Malm, I think, radically extends that in a way, I think, which I find convincing, that the social is behind the natural, right? That there is a social determinant, and it is specifically fossil capital and the emission of carbon emissions, which is determined by this form of social order, which creates climate change. So it's not purely natural; it's socialized nature or humanized nature.
So I take that, and let me restate. I suppose in the classical paradigm, you need a revolution to resolve the contradiction of the internal contradictions of bourgeois society between the forces and relations of production. It doesn't seem to me that, and this goes back to, it's another way of saying the same thing, that you don't need to reconstitute the relations of production in capitalism in order to solve the problems that are posed by climate change. So you can get rid of fossil capital, and a lot of people are going to make a lot of money on wind power. They already are, right? And on solar, and so on. So that seems to me eminently likely and feasible. Georgia.
I have a Zizek'ian way to invert. So you asked the question, can capitalism solve climate change? And that's precisely the wrong question. In fact, the question that I think Malm and Tooze poses, can climate change solve capitalism? They're trying to reverse it and ask the question in a different way. I don't really have a follow on from that, other than
it was good. It was actually quite good. So that's
okay. I'm glad I that's a swing and a hit. So I'll accept that and just shut up now.
Well, that's the intellectual honesty we want here on this podcast.
I wanted to challenge a bit this contrast also of the social democratic kind of time frame with the revolutionary one. I'm not sure I'm convinced. I think the social democratic time frame, particularly in the middle of the 20th century, it had that same urgency. It accepted in the 1940s, it felt the immediate pressure, not least the immediate pressure of a world war against the Nazis. So the methods were different there, right? The way in which they proposed to resolve the problems was different. So the idea that the social democrats are kind of, that the classical tradition of social democracy is just ambling along kind of comfortably and with everything in the distance and so on, I think that's something of a caricature, particularly when you're talking, say, about Keynes giving radio addresses in the 1940s. It's very clear, 1941, 42, it's very clear that there is an immediate emergency. So I'm not sure that the eco-Leninist paradigm and the social democratic one have, at least in their kind of classical formulations in the 20th century, the Leninist and social democratic paradigms have kind of, that the emergency is kind of deferred in one and not the other. So I'm not quite sure that setup kind of works, really.
I think I'm not sure. I think you're giving it a bit short shrift. The idea of the bracket slow forward march of labour, like the start of the film 1900, zooming in on that famous picture, the fourth step. People, I mean, maybe I'm just reading too much into my own mental pictures of this, but the social democratic, the walking forward, whereas Leninism is the kind of the armored train going much faster.
I think that's right.
But there's but look, I mean, it was, you're talking, I mean, I think that kind of that slow incremental gradualism was, that was a specific strain. So, that's the Bernstein revisionist kind of idea.
Fabians as well.
Yeah, indeed. But by the middle of the 20th century, if you're talking about Keynes writing in the Great Depression, right, or kind of negotiating about what the future kind of economic institutions of the United Nations should look like, that seems to me it's in a very immediate context of a crisis, rather than the Bernstein vision of these gradualist kind of reform and transformation. So I think it's important just to be clear about what we're talking about and not to kind of force the contrast. So you still, though, I have to say, Alex, despite your honesty, which is deeply appreciated, you failed to actually address the question that I said, right, which was about the how does this politics relate to existing power structures, right? So for Malm, the absence of a revolutionary actor kind of, as you say, he is forced into blowing up pipelines, radical activism, more and more extreme measures that have to be undertaken to meet this kind of terrifying civilizational challenge, including the extreme vision of using war communism as a model. But who is going to do it, right? Because it's not an organized labor movement. So who's it going to be? It's going to be the existing states that are going to do it. And
no, not the states. It's activists, right, who are doing
well,
this.
No, but it's not activists are not going to run the state. They want the state to do, do activism in order to get the state to do certain kinds of things, right? So it's going to be our existing states doing this. And so the follow-on conclusion from that is that he's effectively providing legitimacy for existing states to act in certain ways.
Yeah,
and for the radical kind of movement, he's providing them with a kind of the glamorous kind of pixie dust of revolutionary Marxism, and making them feel more radical than perhaps they are, right?
I totally agree with you. I just don't think that it's the gotcha you think it is, because Malm is explicit about it. And this is what I said already.
Well, no, I don't think he is, because he accepts.
He is. Sorry, let me just quote the same thing again, right? Because all we have to work with is a dreary bourgeois state tethered to the circuits of capital, as always. He says this, right? So he knows that, and he says that that this sort of activism, and I think this is actually Tooze's reading of it, but he quotes Malm directly in saying that the forms of direct action that Malm proposes will lead to polarization, will lead to conflict, and that will, in some ways, maybe all the kids with placards will persuade some policymakers to change, or will force other people into it, or if you blow a pipeline 2 times, by the 3rd time, maybe no one's going to insure it, and that will lead to a shift away from fossil fuels and so on. So I think that's, I think Malm answers that question. I think the problem
is not war communism, right? I mean, it's just capitalism, a different kind of capitalism.
I agree, and that's where there's this illusion, and I have a lot of problem with this war metaphor, actually, which we'll come on to discuss when we talk about war. But I think, that is precisely the problem. The just on a kind of practical level, okay, so you've got these activists blowing up pipelines. He assumes that there will be a polarization, which means that there will be some mass of people in favor of this sort of direct action. It'll drag people along, perhaps taking, maybe kind of civil rights activism as an example or so on. Yes, maybe, but I just think, I think it will be so repulsive to so many people, because what you're basically promising people, right? It's like to take from Lenin, right? You're not saying bread, peace, and land. Because you're not giving them peace, right? You're promising a lot of disruption. If people are willing to buy that, fine, they might be willing to deal with some disruption, but you have to at least promise them bread and land, speaking metaphorically. And Malm doesn't provide that either. So I think it will be repulsive to a very large body of people.
Well, I guess he offers less bread, no peace, and greener land. So
that's right.
That's not.
So technically
it's more bread, because there's definitely not going to be more meat. So, or rather, there's going to be no more meat.
It's bad for you because it's carbs, Alex, and so you should be
meat
eating
is the
vegetables.
new bread.
Yeah.
So,
and it's also requires being manufactured and so on.
Do you say bread is the meat of vegetables?
I don't know. George,
I said meat is the new bread, which is a Tracy Jordan line from 30 Rock. No, I think I think that one thing to that I think is really useful about the Malm book and the Tooze review is kind of within the environmental movement there's a clear do you want the big green state and the easy new Green Deal option, or do you want something which is actually within within the movement, very much more radical, and is, I think, more likely to probably have some sort of I guess mass buy-in and effect that way. And that's what Malm outlines, and I think it is quite valuable for that reason, and an important read, because it isn't the kind of we can just kind of circumvent national democracy and like lock in some like post Corbyn, post Bernie, like Green New Deal, it'll all be fine. I mean, I think he's at least within the terms that the environmental movement sets itself, taking it much more seriously and responding in the terms that every environmentalist in some ways should be responding. Like, if you think it's really this serious, this is the sort of thing you should do. I mean, I don't agree with the premise, but I think he should. And when we talked to him, he was very, I think the consistency of his position and the kind of the probity, the intellectual probity that he shows is, that is quite admirable, because he follows things through to their conclusion, even if basically the conclusion is you need to blow up as many pipelines, 2, 3, however many times. And there's a few people who really follow the logic through, but I think he is one of them.
So, I mean, given all this, I think it seems to me like there is no, like Tooze wants to cast the Eco-Leninism as a kind of hard-nosed, kind of steely-eyed political realism, but it doesn't seem to me to be that at all. It's deeply politically naive, right? Because Leninism wasn't about taking over the state, but about smashing the state up, famously, and substituting for it new organs of state power, which emerged organically from working class revolt. So given we're not going to get that, right, my guess is that what would actually happen is, depending on the extent of this kind of eco-Leninist, the influence on radical activism to varying degrees, will end up with varying big green states, which will be legitimated and rolled out in various contexts, depending on, various kind of circumstances, and to a greater or lesser extent legitimated by an eco-Leninist paradigm. And so, given his inability to really think through his premise, from his starting premise about the absence of an organized working class movement, an organized revolutionary movement, he will inevitably end up, kind of recreating what he supposedly sets out to address. That seems to me just, but he doesn't accept that. So he can talk about dreary bourgeois states, but the fact is he'll end up providing a rationale for recreating a green capitalism. It might not be a Green New Deal, but it'll be a green capitalism, and that seems to me just to flow from the logic of the argument. But I wanted to move on to, I suppose, reading it through the prism of another emergency, which is the Ukraine war, because I think this is genuinely fascinating, because rereading Tooze's essay just from November last year, it already feels like years have elapsed, even though it's only a matter of months since he wrote it, and also to think about to think through the consequences. So Malm's book is infused with martial imagery. He even talks about, in one point, the immune system kind of having infantry. So he's very attached, and along the model of war communism, he's very attached to martial metaphors, to martial ideas of organization, and all of that. And so, and kind of we got it now, right? So we're in a kind of proxy war in Ukraine. The member states of NATO are anyway. And how do things look from the vantage point of a geopolitical standoff with an energy power like Russia? How does eco-Leninism look now?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, a very difficult one. So I'm going to do it in a bit of a tangential way, because one of the things I did want to say about War and Peace, not the novel, is that in Malm's book, in the one that we're discussing specifically, Corona, Climate, War, Communism, that Malm's really sarcastic about pacifism. Really his target here is environmentalists who refuse direct action in favor of gradualism and so on. He says, imagine that instead of a war on want or class war, we'd have instead peace on want or class peace. Aha, got you, right? Yeah, sort of, except I think that speaks to a limited imagination on Malm's part, that there's nothing between this peace and war dichotomy. that either you have the metaphor of war, and war not just as class war, but war really as military conflict and militarization and the whole situation of war communism in the early 20s, or you have peace, including class peace. And I think, well, no, I mean, you can have, class struggle, democratic struggle, which is neither could be described as peace nor specifically fits into the framework of war. So I think there's a real limit to its imagination there, which doesn't really get me around to answering your question about energy, I guess, specifically, Phil. But it is telling that Malm is that Lenin faced fuel scarcity, but that isn't our problem today. And it's actually like, well, we might not have fuel scarcity as such, but we don't produce, we don't produce, huh?
Not in Brazil, maybe, but here.
There's no objective scarcity, right?
Oh, you mean in the world, right?
Yeah, there's no fuel. There's not a scarcity of fuel. There's not a scarcity of fuel. There's what we don't do is produce enough energy cheaply, and so I think he's kind of blasé about that, because for him, the production of greater energy is for him not necessarily an index of greater civilization, which it is for me, and it should be for every humanist and Marxist indeed.
So just actually one thing that you said, Alex, which I think is really important about about Malm's book, is who the audience is. And I think it's a very effective book for the audience. And this kind of just struck me, like hearing you say this, but it really is environmentalists who don't or didn't want direct action. Like, it's basically, I mean, maybe there is a kind of an eco-Leninist, like, I don't know, impulse to take people who were already convinced of the importance of the cause, but not prepared to act kind of politically in a more radical way, and to radicalize them, or to show that their position doesn't work on its own terms, and to kind of like train these cadres of revolutionary, in inverted commas, pipeline blower uppers. But to address, I guess, what you were sort of posing, Phil, like in the context of I mean, some people have kind of in a weird way supported or thought that there is something, a silver lining, I guess is the way to put it, around the kind of Russia-Ukraine conflict, because it does potentially make energy more expensive in Europe, and energy should be overpriced or should be more expensive because we should use less of it. So there is a kind of, you can see a logic there of like, well, if you want people to use less energy, then you should be not necessarily politically in favor of things which cause this, but you should at least point out that there are dependencies, energy dependencies, which are unsustainable, and actually there are less energy intensive ways that we could live our lives, which could be positive or more. So
there are two points flow from this. The first is obviously that the question of the popular willingness to bear the costs, right, of a green transition, a Green New Deal, let alone, eco-Leninist war communism, whatever, right, is being tested right now because they're preparing for a winter. And the way they're preparing for it, in Germany at least, is they're firing up all their old dirty coal plants. The British government is procrastinating, but looks like it will probably keep or open up, I think, a coal plant in Cumbria, and is looking to find ways to sustain, to build up fossil fuel capacity, given the fact that the Western powers are trying to carve Russia out of the global economy, and certainly to carve them out of providing energy to Europe. And the reason they're firing up their old, coal power stations is because they don't think, they know they can't take people with them, right? They know that they can't get the citizens of Western Europe to accept a cold, shivering in the cold this winter for the sake of defending Ukraine from Vladimir Putin, let alone the idea of a kind of a global energy transition. So that seems to me to be one kind of clear consequence of the war in Ukraine, right? Is these dreary bourgeois states simply don't have the capacity to undertake this kind of transformation. Though I suppose, the emergency is precisely the way in which they seek the kind of legitimacy that they so sorely lack, right? And this is something which is simply beyond Malm, I think. He doesn't think about the fact that crisis kind of emergency politics is embedded in the functioning of these dreary bourgeois states. It's not something which kind of is imposed on them from outside.
Yeah, so I guess on the point about like dreary bourgeois states being legitimated through emergencies, I think this is like, so my point would kind of, not too highfalutin, but would be like, you had the nation state that legitimated itself through representing citizenry. Then you had the member state. This is in the British case, particularly, you see it quite strikingly, that legitimated itself through intra-elite relationships across Europe. And now you have this, I think it's like the dreary bourgeois emergency state that's looking for a way to legitimate itself. It can't produce it through any sort of representative mechanism with the citizenry. It can't really, in the British case at least, no longer a member state. You can't rely on those things. So it's like the reaching for any sort of emergency. Is it COVID? Is it Ukraine? Is it something else which is going to come up? Cost of living crisis. I mean, the Tories in this country are probably lining this one up pretty nicely for the winter, because there is no other way to legitimize and to kind of at least kind of have negative consent, i.e., not active objection to the state except through saying we have this emergency. It's worse than all the other ones. You need to do what we're saying. Things are terrible. This kind of playbook, I think it's quite like many things. It's very advanced historically in the case of Britain, but it's present across the whole of Europe and potentially the rest of the world.
Well, I mean, I think the thing about the Ukraine war is that it's not an emergency and it doesn't serve as emergency politics. I think, as we've discussed on this podcast before, if speaking as a citizen of a NATO country, like, we are not at war, right? Like that, yes, there's a proxy war, right? But it's not, it's still kind of hyper real to an extent. And for all that there's, waving of Ukraine flags and all the rest that goes along with it, citizens in Sweden and Germany and the UK and the US aren't at war in a kind of direct sense in terms of involving a militarization of society. That isn't happening yet. Now, we don't know what might happen. We've discussed on a recent episode, which you won't have heard yet, actually, listener, but about kind of in response to our book about whether there might be kind of some growing militarization and so on.
So we've chatted about this point then about how much the Ukraine crisis and its costs for citizens in Western states, how much that tells us about their willingness to tolerate green transition, Green New Deal, let alone Eco-Leninism. I suppose the second question, which is linked to it, is the irrationality, it seems to me, of I suppose, of the dreary bourgeois states in this situation. At the moment, like, there's lots of frantic commentary in the press about the implosion of Germany's growth model, for instance. So as the powerhouse of the EU, it's always had large export surpluses, exporting all of its industrial equipment and so on, at the core of the Eurozone. And now, because of the increased import costs, it's lost all of that export surplus. And there's, trade union leaders and bosses who are telling the German government that you're at risk of deindustrializing Germany, given the fact that you've put us in this situation where import costs are so high that Germany's growth model is falling apart. And I mean that, this is just to illustrate the point about the irrationality of pursuing exacerbating and recklessly, from the start of the conflict, kind of the NATO expansion, which is the background, NATO expansion into Eastern Europe, which is the background to the war in Ukraine, but also kind of constantly increasing the pressure in the conflict, flooding Ukraine with weapons. As Richard Sakwa told us in a previous episode, Boris Johnson telling Zelensky to avoid any kind of opening up talks with Moscow, Britain effectively sabotaging talks between Ukraine and Moscow, and so on. All of that seems to me to speak to a rationality that doesn't clearly link to any kind of sensible capitalist outlook, right? That if you had the state functioning as the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, it seems to me, if that were the model, then seems to me like it should be functioning better than it is, because the damage to economies, the damage to the political economy of leading Western states seems to me severe and extreme. And so, again, this kind of the irrationality of what's happening with the geopolitics doesn't seem to me to be anything that can be accounted for within Malm's framework.
You can apply a very vulgar Marxist approach here, which is that if the state is the committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie or whatever, for uniting and organizing capitalists, essentially, it's broken down many of its capacities in the last 30 years. So that maybe means that capitalists or capital is like more open to, going their own way and showing how their individual rationality leads to sort of collective irrationality. So I guess, it's not particularly like a detail focused point, you might put it, but like the conditions are there for increasing irrationality, because capital is fundamentally irrational. Like, this is the whole point, that individually rational, collectively not so much.
What's your point about
the state doesn't
then
function to? Well, because maybe the idea would be that the state in the last 30 years, particularly across Western Europe, has seen its capacities to just be shredded. Like, this is one of the things about neoliberalism, is potentially that you've now moved to the regulatory state. So instead of a state with any capacity to solve problems, it's just regulates and creates rules. It doesn't have that binding effect across capital. So, I mean, as I said, it's more of a big picture.
But neoliberalism wasn't
to throw in there.
So, and my objection to that is that neoliberalism and that whole state transformation wasn't irrational. I mean, it was rational from the perspective of capital, and the transformation that was imposed on the state worked. I mean, it was functional for capital as it became increasingly financialized, and as it drove, and the state drove, greater inequality, wage repression, and so on. So, it worked, and it was rational. Now, it now is confronted with problems that it now can't resolve. And COVID was a good example of that, where instead of using state capacities and directing it to, keeping people safe and having enough hospital beds and effectively being able to resolve that question in a kind of rational way while keeping things as normal as possible, it was unable to do that. It had to impose these kind of emergency powers and restrictions, which were relatively ineffective in actually, solving the actual problem. So, and the Ukraine case is similar in maybe it's not similar because it's not a question of state capacity, but it's at least an irrationality of the state at this moment in time. But I'm just taking issue, I guess, with George, with your characterization of the state as somehow increasingly irrational over the past 30 years. I'm not sure that's entirely right.
I would take issue with your taking issue of my characterization. I mean, isn't the whole point that like any rationality in one time horizon or one level within like capital's view of the world is irrational at another level or another time horizon? So
sure.
Like it could be kind of rational to like, to have this state, like changes in the state, and to have all these changes in the workforce, like in the short term. But eventually you're going to by destroying organized labor, you're going to undermine your ability as capital to mobilize people. I don't know. I'm kind of
does it need to mobilize people? I don't know, but I mean, I think
well, it needs to function, right? And it doesn't seem to be functioning effectively in pursuing a kind of an irrational geopolitical strategy of confrontation with Russia. I mean,
absolutely.
Like I say, they seem, the businesses are going into the German government and saying, what are you doing? So it's, I mean, I don't know that this conversation is really answering that question, and I'm not sure there is a clear answer. I mean, I'm sympathetic to where George is coming from, but I think you can make a case for the fact that neoliberalism is no, whatever its origins might have been in terms of how it served business needs at the time, that it's failing to serve the institutions and infrastructure that we have politically is failing to meet those needs at the moment. And it's, both in terms of legitimacy with the population, in terms of policy, in terms of strategy, in terms of responding to the various kinds of social and environmental challenges and what have you. But so this takes us to the final point that I wanted to talk about before we turn to some points from listeners. Which is that, so something that's kind of slightly curious to me, it's kind of an intellectual, it seems to me like it's an intellectual gap in Malm's argument, and maybe an important one, which is that he was very taken with lockdown. in the book, he says like it was what strikes him about it is the extent of this sweeping rollout and demonstration of state power, all done at once, in conditions of in extremis, and that he sees this as indication of what's possible to do in extremis, and therefore as providing a kind of a glimpse, or a kind of a glimpse of what a more hopeful scenario for climate action might look like. I suppose what I'm left wondering is, where does lockdown come from in his model, right? So I think I've got an account of lockdown. I think I can explain where it comes from, but I was a lockdown skeptic. And so I can see it arising from within the kind of context in which we live. Whereas given how bleak his outlook is, it seems to me strange that he sees states acting in such a positive manner, or positive at least by his reckoning, as lockdown was.
I mean, I sort of disagree with the premise of it, or rather, I disagree with your reading of Malm. I had a different reading of what he argues. I mean, also as a lockdown skeptic, but nevertheless, I actually think that Malm was critical of lockdown, perhaps impressed at the ability of state autonomy to go against business interest. I think that he is impressed by, and I think I'm impressed by that too. I think that's a good thing, perhaps. It certainly is, if we're talking about state irrationality, that if the state can act in a way, in some sort of greater interest and not servicing the direct needs of a certain fraction of capital, then yeah, that's kind of interesting, right? That's more rational. But I think that as to the reading of Malm, I think he says, states actually didn't demonstrate a great deal of state capacity in what they did, because they knew what was coming over the hill. They knew that zoonotic transfer was coming, and they didn't do anything about it in terms of, and of course his answer to that is more preservation and so on, less intrusion into tropical area, not in raw nature, wild nature rather. But so that, and then on the other hand, when it actually came to imposing lockdowns, he sees them as problematic. I mean, he's critical about measures like tracking and tracing and the kind of all the forms of social control that involves. So I guess I don't really have an answer to the question.
You don't see the problem?
I don't think that Malm. Yeah, I don't think that Malm thinks, lockdown. I mean, maybe he does. I don't know, but at least in the book, I don't think he says. He doesn't say, lockdown was great. I think he's impressed by the power that the state and the autonomy that the state demonstrated with regard to business. But I don't think he was in favor of that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that's the question, right? So the autonomy of the state seems to me to be an indication of irrationality and dysfunction, rather than an indication of a kind of a glimpse of a hopeful future of. So
what? So you want a kind of good old fashioned straight back bourgeois state that just like serves the bourgeois interests, and you know where you are with it. It's very, very solid and dependable. But and I mean, like I think Tooze's review is very astute in this kind of noting that many on the left, at least at first, thought that lockdowns were slightly encouraging, and he does say that Malm, he does point out that Malm argued that lockdowns strip the state down to its barest relative autonomy. So there is something like in this reading somewhat positive, or it not positive about lockdowns, but it revealed something that is a positive underlying factor, that the state is able to be more detached, like to be more relatively autonomous than it had been previously, which and then he continues.
So you mock George, but it's not so much nostalgia for the old bourgeois state that I'm expressing, but the idea that the state is connected to social interest and constituent, kind of expresses the interests of constituents. Now you can make, the Marxist critique of that was the state should represent another group. But the idea, it wasn't, the critique wasn't to kind of sever the notion of representation. The fact that the state acted as the executive committee of the bourgeoisie was an accomplishment. It wasn't just a critical comment on the nature of the state, but also the fact that they did have an agency that was capable of acting on their collective behalf was something to be, was something that had to be replicated through the proletarian seizure of power. So the fact that it's stripped down to this idea that, it's relative autonomy in the context of lockdown, that doesn't seem to me I don't draw the same conclusion from it that Malm does. And it does seem to me kind of spooky, both in the sense of genuinely creepy in this kind of immediate authoritarian sense, but also spooky from the viewpoint of a classical kind of Marxian social theory, where you have the state acting seemingly, kind of far beyond the interests of business. Because if business, if the interests of business had really been reckoned with, rather than, just Amazon and Deliveroo and so on, then it seems to me we probably wouldn't have had lockdown at all.
So I think Tooze, or I guess more the position, it's kind of a challenge for the position that you're articulating, or actually no, maybe the better way to put it is that the moral element is more introduced, not in the Marxist tradition, but I think many on the left, as Tooze puts it, kind of regarded lockdowns as, quote, bringing out the best in modern bourgeois democracy, the respect for life trumping the respect for property, a victory for the egalitarian premise to which democracy is sworn. So I think Tooze does get this absolutely right, that there was that introduction of like the moral lens, which obviously isn't present in Marxism, of like, oh, finally these bourgeois states, they're doing what they're living their best selves and their best lives, and they're actually doing what they. Yeah,
but it was bare life. It wasn't the pursuit. It wasn't freedom, liberty, and the freedom to pursue happiness, and that kind of.
No, I agree. But people. This is how I think how it was, at least initially understood, that there was some sort of like kernel of like moral,
humane concern.
Yeah, humane. That's a good way to put it. Because like an epiphany of care, finally, that the state realized what it should have been realizing all along, that people are people, and they actually shouldn't die, and people were quite happy with that.
I think that's probably right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the point about the autonomy, and I think it was the state demonstrating a degree of autonomy from capitalist interests. But it was for irrational ends, right? So, I think we can say that, yes, as Phil rightly says, the state's ability to represent interests in a general sense, that sort of general will of the bourgeoisie, is an achievement, right? But the problem is to the extent that lockdown showed the bourgeois state acting autonomously, the problem was that it was for irrational ends. So it's not exactly the example you'd want to take. Maybe Malm sees in it, though, and being kind of properly dialectical about it, that it shows a possibility in there, that there's a kernel there of it being able to act, but you could turn that towards more rational ends. And I think that's the kind of line of argument that he pursues, that through pressure, through direct action, whatever, you can force the state into that autonomous action and, prohibiting fossil fuels,
I think that's probably true. And I mean, so this is the irony of the whole thing. I think his kind of eco-Leninism is like the caricature of what all the critics and opponents of Lenin and Leninism said, which is that, you have kind of a vanguard elite and a state that will substitute for the organized action of the labor movement and the working class, and that it will become an authoritarian actor in its own right. And I think that is exactly where Malm ends up, and I think he's happy, in fact, for that to happen. Anyway, I think we need to move on to some listener questions, and there's one in particular that I wanted to talk about. It's because it's so detailed and rich, and I think there's enough in there for us to talk about fruitfully. So it's from Ran Heilbrunn. I'm not going to read the whole thing out, but I will just summarize it, which is that Malm has this idea of a global subject. So in relation to a global crisis such as climate change, it requires a global subject. And Heilbrunn, our listener Ran Heilbrunn, suggests that this falls to Alashian critique of globalism, which he developed some years back in his book, the 1985 book, The Minimal Self. And so in this idea, there is, globalists that he kind of Lash's critique of this globalist idea is that when problems are formulated in such kind of remote and abstract ways, they are effectively paralyzing because they don't connect with people in the way they need to in order to induce political action. And so for it to be a genuine, for a problem to be genuinely meaningful, it needs to be formulated in ways that connect to people in much more kind of immediate, direct, concrete ways rather than in these kind of grand and remote ways. And so our listener here is asking whether or not Malm's point falls to the Alashian critique. Namely, this is the listener now, namely, how do we explain the mismatch between, on the one hand, the gravity of the climate crisis and the justness of the climate cause, and on the other, the apathy of the general public and the inability of climate activism to seriously take off? And he's wondering if Lash provides an answer to that. So, what do you think?
I think that's once again an excellent question from the listener there, who I had the opportunity to meet. He came to our event in Berlin last month, stayed around for drinks afterwards, and it was great to chat to him. So it's great to hear from Ran again. And again, I think a very insightful question. I don't have very much to say to that, I guess, other than I entirely agree, and I think that's very insightful. I think that intangibility of these global problems is a genuine problem to be reckoned with, unless we just want to throw our hands up and say, well, we can't deal with it, or just retreat into various national politics, which again, that's not saying that national politics aren't important or the building block, but it can't be just a retreat. But I think the comment is entirely right in that the environmental movement and that their critique and planetary outlook actually just, as he says, adds another layer of complexity to this political ecological paradox.
I think kind of to answer this in a bit of a diagonal way, I think it's definitely a problem that the climate movement kind of poses itself. Like, why aren't more people interested in taking action on this? And I think there is, to draw this out, like, what are the consequences of this likely to be? I think there is something about how, like, in the COVID context, to kind of draw this parallel out a little bit, Laura Dodsworth's book on fear is pretty good about like detailing all of the nudge tactics and the kind of behavior change and the use of kind of social psychology to get people to act and to change their behavior. So I think it's obviously already happened, but I don't think there's any way in which it won't deepen and continue. That the climate movement will, in addition to resorting to kind of more directly political modes of mobilization, there's also going to be a whole set of nudges, presumably designed to move people towards a position more accepting of, on the one hand, political action, on the other hand, kind of sacrifices and decreased standard of living around kind of climate change policy. So I think it's, there is something about the self-understanding of the problems that the climate change movement sees itself as facing, which is one about, like, how do we get the masses, the cattle, the idiots to kind of join our cause? Like, we can do it through a whole set of quite increasingly sophisticated behavioral techniques. I don't think that really answers the question, but it was a thought that was provoked by it.
I have a thought, and perhaps, which I hope is a response to Rand's question, and then I guess we can leave it there for this session. But I suppose what strikes me is the Lashian kind of response is very much in Lash's kind of petty bourgeois outlook, self-professed petty bourgeois outlook, in the sense of that it's beyond the capacity of people to kind of measure up to these grand problems, and that really the only action that you have available is, kind of community, even the national kind of horizons, in the way in which Lash has formulated his understanding of what political action looks like in opposition to all the grand kind of global justice. And I think I don't think there has to be a disconnect between the two things, between ordinary kind of political action by individuals and global, and kind of global problems. I think what's lacking is the intermediary institutions that would make political action at the local or individual level connect to action at the global level. And that is, I think, what's lacking. And most obviously is any kind of connection to politics at the level, let alone politics at the, let alone kind of politics which was mediated through organized labor and the working class. Because that was obviously the traditional kind of vision of internationalism, was that the proletariat would overcome the nation state through the process of seizing power, so that it was understood as a global process, but one which was very intimately tied through the very kind of practice of workplace organizing. And it's those kind of intermediary institutions and political practices that have been totally gutted, and that is the consequence of where we are now. So I think that would be my attempt to answer Rand's question.
All right, that's it for this episode. And actually, that is the end of the first section, the first 6 months of the 2022 Reading Club syllabus. This has been the section on emergency politics and control. As I said at the top of this, we want this to be an ongoing conversation. So now that the 6 episodes have come out, hopefully lots of local reading clubs have been able to discuss all these works, or will be able to do so in the next weeks. So if you do have questions and points made, issues that have been raised over the course of these past 6 months, do send them in. Do let us know. We'd be eager to engage with them in a kind of ongoing sense, address them both in the next reading clubs as well as maybe in other venues as well. If anything raises itself, maybe we can do a dedicated episode on this in the future. So just to say what's coming up, the next 3 months will be ones that I'll be leading on. It's on cynical ideology. And the idea here is that declining trust in institutions has created a combustible situation. We believe less and less in official narratives, but nevertheless seem to carry on participating in society as it is. Is this because we lack trust in each other as well as in the state institutions and so on? And finally, how can we distinguish skepticism from paranoia? Is there a argument for a lot of things that are called conspiracy theories? Should we be a little bit more cynical about the motives and the ways of acting that elites have? Or is this all falling prey to the worst form of conspiracy theories that a more structural understanding would quash? So anyway, we're going to take the next 3 readings, obviously one by one, but the idea is that everybody, all listeners, read all of them and follow along. And again, as I said at the beginning, you don't necessarily need to feel pressure to read each one in advance of each session. If you do and want to send in questions each time, that's fantastic. We highly encourage that. But if not, again, it's an ongoing exploration of 3 of the most critical issues of our time as we see them. So again, it's a long and open-ended process. Just to say what's coming up in the first one, which will be at the end of July, it is Slavoj Žižek's How Marx Invented the Symptom, which is the first chapter from his first major book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, and in my opinion is absolutely brilliant. And so I look forward to rereading that and to be able to discuss that. If you're not yet able to get that, it's also available as a slightly edited down version in the collected edition Mapping Ideology, and we'll provide a PDF to that to Patreon subscribers. We'll be going through the summer, at least the summer in the north, which will take in Trust, which is a chapter from Anthony Giddens, The Consequences of Modernity. And then we'll finish off in September with Conspiracy Theory, looking at Timothy Melly's Empire of Conspiracy. Each of these is just a chapter or a couple of chapters. It's no more than 100 pages and often only around 50 pages. So it's something that is really digestible. And of course, if you do want to read more, we have provided plenty of additional readings to delve deeper into these issues of cynicism, of trust, of conspiracy theories, and paranoia. So we look forward to you joining us. If you want to set up a local reading club or find other people who have already set up one in the city where you live, do get in touch at info@bungacast.com. And that's it. Catch you next month. Bye-bye.